Worst period of unrest in a decade. Fury over the burning of the Quran refuses to die down. That one act appears to have undone years of efforts to win over hearts and minds. On the streets, there appears to be nothing but a visceral hatred for the West and its values. And the Taliban has been quick to capitalise on this incident. It says it's behind a series of revenge attacks on US troops. Well, that's put President Hamid Karzai in a difficult position. On one hand, he's been calling for calm. On the other, he says he can understand the motives behind the violence. Well, it is, of course, a major headache for the United States, which is committed to disentangling itself from a costly and bloody conflict within 2 years. Well, this week, the White House has apologised profusely and repeatedly.
We deeply regret the incident that has led to these protests. We are condemning it in the strongest possible terms, but we also believe that the violence must stop and the hard work of trying to build a more peaceful, prosperous, secure Afghanistan must continue.
Well, international forces are due to stay in Afghanistan until the year 2014. Then they'll take on more of a consultancy role. But what realistically can they achieve with such hostility from the people they're supposed to be trying to train and protect? My guest tonight, Asad Omer, is the Afghan ambassador here in Paris. In Berlin tonight, Thomas Ruttig is the co-director of the Afghanistan Analysis Network. Ronald Neumann, he's the former American ambassador to Afghanistan. He's also the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He's in the United States tonight. And also here in the studio with me is Adam Bachko. He's the author of Shadow Justice, a report on Taliban justice. He's also a researcher at the EHESS Institute. To you all, many thanks indeed for being with us this evening. If I could start with you, Ambassador, were you surprised about the violent reaction to this burning of the Quran, which, after all, the United States says was a mistake?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course, it's a mistake. From a demonstration, I'm not surprised. But violence, yes. Because according to Afghan constitutions, everybody can demonstrate, no problem. There's a freedom to get together and express their condemnation, whatever, but not violence. And President Karzai called upon people to be calm. And one thing, and then another thing, it's only in certain areas there was this kind of violence, but not in other areas. For example, in Logar, near the Kabul, there absolutely was a peaceful demonstration, and also in Badghis there was a peaceful demonstration. Just they condemned
but we have seen some pretty serious incidents, haven't we? A lot of burning, a lot of riots, a lot of violence. As many as 30 people killed in under a week of protests.
Yeah.
Now, what does this tell us about the Afghan people? Because these are not just fanatics out on the streets, are they? Are the Afghan people particularly pious, or is this a people fed up with a foreign occupation and they're venting their anger?
No, I think it's not that. Okay, it was a violence, but we have to say here that some other hands also playing. For example, Afghan newspapers, they are saying that some enemies of peace in Afghanistan, they are taking advantage of this incident in order to create some disorder. That's true. And also they want to really destroy this confidence is already built between Afghan army and the coalition, our partners.
Adam Bachko, this is a dream recruitment drive for the Taliban, isn't it? Incidents like this attract people to their group, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, if we have to understand what is happening now, more than the Quran burning, more than the issue, more than the details, this story tells us a couple of things. It tells us that now, in the cities, the Taliban have a capability to mobilize. They didn't mobilize for this demonstration, but they can capitalize on huge discontent. And the discontent has more to do with a series of humiliation and a feeling of humiliation. When you drive in Kabul and an army patrol passes, you have to stop and you're going to be targeted by a machine gun. People have had a lot of trouble with the Americans' practices there, or even actually all the Western armies. And in that sense, the Quran burning is more like another event. One more with the sacrality of it, but
It's a
one
final
more.
straw. And it shows a more worrying trend, doesn't it? That some Afghans might find that their interests are more closely aligned, their values perhaps are more closely aligned with those of the Taliban than they are with Western forces.
It is already the fact. You already have that in most of the countryside, for example, in the south and the east. You have that in small cities. You have that more and more in the north, despite the fact that the population is not Pashto. And you're getting that more and more within populations that should be, from their experience of the past, more open to the Western forces. But we have lost most of the capital, social capital we had.
All right, let's bring in Thomas Ruttig, who's in Berlin from the Afghanistan Analysis Network. Now, you've got a very dangerous situation now for not only American soldiers, but also American aid workers. Any Westerners in Afghanistan are in danger with these furious protests going on. Do you think that the coalition troops can last another 2 years in these kind of this kind of situation? Thomas Ruttig. All right, let's go to Ronald Newman. Perhaps you can hear us instead. Let's talk about the US strategy. Now, it is to train Afghan troops so that they can eventually take responsibility for their own security. An incident like this puts that in jeopardy, doesn't it?
It certainly makes it harder. I think putting it in jeopardy is probably a little much. We have lived, I don't want to minimize this, but we have lived through some very serious riots before. We had a very serious one in 2006 in Kabul when I was ambassador, which caused the meltdown then of the police force. But we got past it, and I think we will get past this one. So certainly it makes it more difficult. I think there are a lot of reasons among Afghans for anger, and this has allowed them to break forth. I don't think it means it is impossible. I think one should be a little careful about rushing to such broad conclusions within a week.
Right. Yes. We should be careful indeed. But when you've got when you're asking American and other nations to send soldiers to fight, where their supposed allies, the Afghan troops, are shooting them. In the case of the French soldiers last month, you've got the Taliban claiming that it's got staff to poison American soldiers. How can they work together? There needs to be a certain amount of trust, doesn't there, between the two sides, if your strategy can be put into practice?
Oh, absolutely. And the last thing I want to do now that I'm out of the government is sound like I'm giving simple answers. But there are something over 300,000 Afghans under arms now. We have well over 100,000 NATO troops. I think it's 130,000. So while there is going to be a trust issue, there's no question. At the same time, this is made up of a great many small pieces, and many of them will be untouched. So one shouldn't get in the position of saying, we had 10 traffic accidents yesterday, that proves nobody can drive. It does prove all sorts of things about driving, but not that everybody should stay off the road.
Adam Batchko, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think that if we put in context the Quran burning reaction, first, it already happened a year ago in Kunduz. You had the killings of 12 people, including UN staff. You had a couple of minor events that were not as much covered in the provinces when someone would be killed by American army personnel of the West by mistake. Well, we have to think of those events as really adding to already a gap that was appearing before. And my conversation that I had in Afghanistan with US Army personnel and Afghan Army personnel were very, very, very worrying. I've always heard a lot of distrust between the soldiers and the junior officers. I think that's to grow rather than the reverse.
All right. Thomas Ruttig in Berlin, I believe you can hear us now.
Yes, I hear you very well.
All right. Now, some people are saying that 2014 is too early for Western troops to be pulling out of Afghanistan. I understand from my researchers that you think it needs to be sooner than that.
No, I am convinced that the 2014 deadline has been taken for mainly domestic political reasons in our countries, in the countries which send troops to Afghanistan. I think it's much too short because it doesn't take realities in Afghanistan into consideration sufficiently enough. And I think incidents like what we experience in the moment after the Quran burnings and the protests and the violence show how difficult the situation is and that many things can happen which no one expects. So 2014 is a bit short from my perspective.
Ambassador Omer, I wonder what you think of that.
Yes, 2014, okay, for us, for Afghan government, we are taking all the measures to meet our deadline. And also, space said, we have 362,000 security forces. And of course, there's another 2 years to go, and we need really training and also equipment. Until now, I think things are going on the right way. Don't forget that 50% of the Afghan population are under control now, security of Afghan forces. And within 1 year, end of this year, will be 75,000, 75%. So that's, I think, is going in the right direction. And of course, as we have signed a treaty with France, with other countries, so we need training, we need support, we need a logistical support. But we are confident.
That support is going to be steadily withdrawn, isn't it? The United States will be cutting aid.
So that we don't know yet, but we are of course discussing all that. This is not yet sure how much will be cut off, but we are preparing another conference for Tokyo in July, exactly about the aid problem, and then also there will be a Chicago meeting in the month of May. So there are some meetings coming up
on the horizon.
in order to.
But how will you convince your allies that Afghan soldiers won't turn on the troops that are training them, as we saw with the French troops just last month? What assurances can you give?
It's true. Okay, until now, what's happened that we focus more on quantity. It's true. The recruitment was really that meet some target and numbers, but Afghans ministries have recognized that we need now to take certain measures in order for the recruitment and to see from where the soldiers are coming, where the family are, so this kind of thing. So that these are certain measures are being taken in order to make sure that this kind of thing will not happen anymore.
Ronald Newman, what do you think? Do you think the Afghan government under Hamid Karzai is doing enough to hold up its end of the bargain?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues here, but I think you've got to be very careful. You're throwing around some terms that I think are being used a little imprecisely. 2014 is a transfer to the Afghan lead. That means their infantry does most of the fighting. It is still envisioned that we will have advisors with them fighting on the ground.
All combat troops are to leave by 2014, no?
No, see, that's when you say that, it leads people to think all combat ceasing. Secretary Panetta just said on February 4 that we will be in combat with Afghans after 2014. You may call them advisors, but they're going to be at many levels of Afghan forces on the ground. We're still going to be flying.
Sorry, but just to clear it up, they won't be taking part in combat against the Taliban.
Yes, they will be taking part in combat operations. You are categorically wrong when you say that. And I would point not to an out-of-office ambassador like myself, but to the Secretary of Defense, who said to the NATO ministers on the 4th of February of this year that U.S. troops will still be engaged in combat with Afghans after 2014. Now, there's some really big issues here. Will we pull down too rapidly and put too much responsibility on the Afghans too quickly, or will this be a more gradual slope? Will we have too few advisors? But most of the big questions that are about success or failure are going to be in how we implement the policy. So it's very important that you focus on what the policy actually is. But in fact, the issues many of the issues
will
of
American
success and
troops
failure aren't the policy.
Will American troops be fighting alone? Because the French government's made it pretty clear that French troops will be leaving by 2014. And if so, what is the significance of that date for Americans?
There will be a great many less foreign troops. There's no question of that. What France will be doing in 2014, I don't know, and I suspect that your upcoming election will have something to say about that. There are NATO decisions that have to be made by all countries, but I think it is a little extreme to say America will be fighting alone. On the other hand, if America rushes for the door, you can be pretty sure that our friends won't be far behind us. So what we do is going to be enormously important in whether there is a sense of consistency or not.
All right, let's put it another way. Then there will be a serious reduction in the number of US troops on the ground. Again, will the Afghan army be ready to take over? They're supposed to take primary responsibility for security by that time. Will they be able to do that?
A very big maybe. There is progress, and there are some big points we have to cross that we haven't yet. If we do this well, and if we thrust responsibility on them, but we're still there to help during this next 2 years, which is a reasonable period, then I think the chances are fairly good. If we look like we're running for the door before they're ready, then the chances get bad. But to say that anybody actually knows now, which is really the beginning of the testing period, is, I think, quite a premature judgment, much as that is beloved, of course, by those who have to make judgments every day on the news.
Well, these judgments are founded on by what governments say. Yes, Ambassador.
Just as I agreed with Ambassador Newman that, if we compare Afghanistan of today, 2012, with Afghanistan 2001, it's really a tremendous progress has been made. Just in the question of army, we have almost 0 soldiers during the 2001, and today we have, as I said, 362,000. It's a big progress in this area, and also maybe not all units are not ready, but there are certain units already. They themselves they're taking up operational mission, and they advance, and our Air Force being rebuilt. So we have some helicopters, and there's some pilots being trained, and so cannot be overnight, but something in the progress in 2 years' time. You can see there is Afghan Air Force.
All right, and where will the money come from?
From our friends, our donors, our friends, partners, yes.
All right. So, Ronald Newman, we're going to ask the American public and elsewhere to indefinitely support and fund this conflict in Afghanistan. 2014 to you is an insignificant date.
No, I didn't say it's an insignificant date, but I think that you exaggerate a little bit. Will the American people support this by 2014? Well, I think a lot of that will depend on whether they think it's working or not. But remember that in 2006, if I had told you that by 2008 or 9 we would have 100,000 troops in Iraq and you would have hardly any news stories about it, you would have ridiculed me. I'm not saying that to say
unfortunately,
that
we have plenty of news stories coming out of Iraq every day.
I'm just pointing out, we do now, but I'm pointing out that 2 years later we still had 100,000 troops there and we had no issues with the domestic politics. That was because the perception changed. The only point I'm making is that public support is not static, it's dynamic.
Right.
If things seem to get better, we will get more time. If things continue to get worse, we'll get less time.
Okay, all right, we're going to have to leave it there just for a moment. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines and the second part of tonight's debate. Don't go away.